The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Eldermere Palace as Queen Consort Cordelia adjusted her emerald tiara one final time. Today marked the 10th anniversary of her marriage to King Edmund, but celebration was the last thing on her mind. Through the tall windows of her private study, she watched as Princess Catherine walked through the royal gardens with her children, waving to the gathered crowd of well-wishers who had come to catch a glimpse of the beloved royal family. Cordelia's jaw tightened as she observed the scene. The people's affection for Catherine had only grown stronger over the years, while her own approval ratings continued to slide. Every poll, every newspaper headline, every whispered conversation in the palace corridors reminded her of the same painful truth. The kingdom preferred the future queen over the current one. "Your Majesty," came a soft voice from behind her. Lady Margaret Thornfield, Cordelia's most trusted advisor and childhood friend, entered the study carrying a leather portfolio. "The morning briefings are ready for your review." Cordelia turned from the window, her expression carefully composed. "What do the numbers look like this week, Margaret?" Margaret hesitated before opening the portfolio. Princess Catherine's approval rating has reached 87%. The public particularly loves her work with the children's literacy program and her recent visit to the flood victims in Westshire Province. "And mine? 42%, Your Majesty. Down 3 points from last month." Cordelia moved to her ornate desk, her fingers drumming against the polished wood surface. At 55, she had worked tirelessly to earn her place beside the king, overcoming years of public skepticism about their relationship. She had been Edmund's closest advisor for nearly 2 decades before their marriage, helping him navigate the complex political landscape that had defined his reign. Yet none of that seemed to matter to the people, who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and their beloved Princess Catherine. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty room. "Prince William has been meeting privately with several members of Parliament. Lord Chancellor Blackwood was seen leaving the prince's residence quite late last evening." This caught Cordelia's attention immediately. Prince William, Catherine's husband and heir to the throne, rarely involved himself in political matters. His focus had always been on his military service and charitable work, leaving the complicated business of governance to his father and stepmother. If he was suddenly taking political meetings, it could only mean one thing. He was preparing for his eventual role as king. Do we know what they discussed? Not specifically, but our sources suggest it involved the upcoming succession reforms. The prince seems particularly interested in modernizing the monarchy's role in government affairs. Cordelia felt a chill run down her spine. The succession reforms had been a contentious issue for months, with various factions in Parliament pushing for changes that would either strengthen or weaken the crown's influence. If William was positioning himself to support certain reforms, he could potentially undermine years of careful political maneuvering that she and Edmund had orchestrated. "Schedule a private dinner with the king for tonight," Cordelia instructed, her mind already working through various scenarios. "And arrange a meeting with Lord Pemberton tomorrow morning. It's time we reminded certain people exactly who holds the reins of power in this kingdom." Margaret made notes in her appointment book before looking up with concern. "Your Majesty, perhaps it would be wise to approach this situation with caution. The prince commands considerable respect among both the military and the younger members of Parliament. Any perceived attack on his position could backfire severely." Cordelia's eyes flashed with determination. "Margaret, I didn't spend 20 years building influence in this palace only to watch it slip away, because people prefer a pretty face and a charitable smile. Catherine may have the public's love, but I have something far more valuable. I understand how power actually works." She moved to a window overlooking the main courtyard, where preparations were underway for that evening's anniversary celebration. Hundreds of guests would attend, including foreign dignitaries, business leaders, and political figures from across the kingdom. It would be the perfect opportunity to send a message about who truly controlled the royal agenda. "I want you to review the guest list for tonight's dinner," Cordelia continued. "Make sure our supporters are seated strategically and ensure that Lord Pemberton has ample opportunity to speak with the foreign trade delegates. If William wants to play politics, he'll learn that I've been playing this game far longer than he has." Margaret nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "What about Princess Catherine? She's scheduled to give the opening remarks tonight. Leave Catherine to me. She may not realize it yet, but her little speeches about unity and progress are about to become much more complicated. It's time she learned that being popular and being powerful are two very different things." As Margaret left to carry out her instructions, Cordelia returned to the window. In the garden below, Catherine was now reading a story to a group of children from a local school, her genuine laughter carrying across the courtyard. The sight should have been heartwarming, but to Cordelia, it represented everything that threatened her carefully constructed position. She had not married the king for love, though affection had grown between them over the years. She had married him because she understood the importance of influence, of being the person who shaped decisions behind closed doors. Edmund trusted her judgment implicitly, sought her counsel on every major decision, and valued her political instincts above all others. But if William began asserting himself more aggressively, if he started building his own power base within the government, that influence could evaporate overnight. The afternoon passed quickly as Cordelia met with various palace officials, reviewing security arrangements for the evening and discussing upcoming state visits. Every conversation reinforced her growing concern that William's recent political activities represented more than just preparation for his future role. Several officials mentioned being approached by representatives of the prince, asking detailed questions about government procedures and parliamentary relationships. By evening, as she prepared for the anniversary dinner, Cordelia had made her decision. She would not wait for William to make his move. Instead, she would force his hand, creating a situation where he would have to either submit to her authority or reveal his true intentions to the entire kingdom. As she descended the grand staircase toward the ballroom, wearing a stunning diamond necklace that had belonged to Edmund's first wife, Cordelia caught sight of William and Catherine greeting guests near the entrance. They looked every inch the perfect royal couple. He in his military dress uniform with its impressive array of medals, she in an elegant navy gown that perfectly complemented the sapphire tiara she wore. But appearances could be deceiving, and Cordelia had learned long ago that in the world of royal politics, today's allies could become tomorrow's enemies with a single misstep. As she approached the royal receiving line, she smiled warmly at the gathered guests, playing the role of the gracious queen consort to perfection. The real performance, however, was just beginning. The anniversary dinner proceeded with all the pageantry expected of a royal celebration, but beneath the glittering surface, tensions simmered like a pot about to boil over. Cordelia watched carefully as Catherine delivered her opening remarks, noting how effortlessly the princess commanded the attention of the distinguished guests. Every word was perfectly chosen, every gesture calculated to project both authority and warmth. Tonight, we celebrate not just a marriage, but a partnership that has guided our kingdom through both triumph and challenge, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly across the ornate ballroom. Queen Consort Cordelia's dedication to public service and her unwavering support of His Majesty's vision for our nation deserves our deepest gratitude. The applause was polite but lukewarm, and Cordelia did not miss the subtle difference in enthusiasm when Catherine had spoken about her earlier compared to when she praised the king's accomplishments. It was a masterful performance, appearing to honor the queen consort while actually highlighting the contrast between popular perception and official protocol. As Catherine concluded her remarks and the formal dinner began, Cordelia seized her first opportunity to implement her strategy. She approached Lord Pemberton, the influential chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who was engaged in conversation with the ambassador from Valeria, one of their kingdom's most important trade partners. "Lord Pemberton, Ambassador Valdez," Cordelia said smoothly, joining their conversation. "I trust you're both enjoying the evening?" "Indeed, Your Majesty," the ambassador replied with a respectful bow. We were just discussing the proposed trade agreement expansion. Lord Pemberton was explaining some of the parliamentary concerns about certain provisions. Cordelia's smile remained perfectly composed, but internally she felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of conversation she needed to control. How fortunate that I happened upon you both. As it happens, I've been working closely with His Majesty on those very provisions. Perhaps we could schedule a private meeting tomorrow to discuss how we might address any remaining concerns. Lord Pemberton looked genuinely pleased by the suggestion. That would be most helpful, Your Majesty. The committee has great respect for your insight into these complex international matters. From across the room, Cordelia noticed William watching their conversation with interest. She made sure her next words carried just far enough for him to overhear. The king has been particularly grateful for my advice on navigating the political sensitivities surrounding this agreement, she continued. He feels that my experience with parliamentary relations has been invaluable in building the consensus necessary for successful passage. It was a carefully calculated statement, designed to reinforce her position as Edmund's primary political advisor, while subtly suggesting that William's recent activities might be redundant or even counterproductive. The message was clear. Important decisions were still being made by the established power structure, not by ambitious heirs looking to accelerate their influence. William's response came sooner than she had anticipated. As the dinner service concluded and guests began to mingle more freely, he approached her near the dessert table, his expression pleasant but his eyes sharp with intelligence. "Stepmother, might I have a word with you privately?" he asked, his tone respectful but firm. Cordelia nodded graciously, following him to a quiet alcove overlooking the palace gardens. The space was semi-private, visible to other guests, but far enough removed to allow for confidential conversation. "I couldn't help but notice your discussion with Lord Pemberton," William began, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and direct manner. "I'm curious about your thoughts on the trade agreement, particularly the sections dealing with military cooperation provisions." The question caught Cordelia slightly off guard. Her knowledge of the trade agreement was substantial, but the military cooperation aspect had been primarily handled by defense officials and William himself, given his extensive military background and connections. "The military provisions are naturally complex," she replied carefully. "His Majesty and I have been focused primarily on the economic and diplomatic implications." "Of course," William said, his tone remaining even. "Though I should mention that the Defense Committee has identified several potential issues that could affect parliamentary approval. Issues that would require someone with both military expertise and political influence to resolve effectively." The implication was unmistakable. William was suggesting that his unique combination of military knowledge and royal authority made him indispensable to the success of this important legislation. It was a direct challenge to her claim of being Edmund's primary advisor on the matter. Before Cordelia could respond, Catherine approached with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Catherine said, though her timing suggested the interruption was entirely intentional. "Ambassador Valdez was asking about the children's education initiative that we discussed with the Valerian delegation last month. He seemed quite impressed with the preliminary results." William's expression brightened genuinely at the mention of the education program, which had been one of Catherine's most successful recent projects. The ambassador mentioned that Valeria is considering implementing a similar program. "That could be an excellent addition to our cultural exchange provisions." Cordelia realized she was witnessing something more sophisticated than she had initially understood. This wasn't simply William making random political moves or Catherine leveraging her popularity. They were working together, combining his political knowledge with her public appeal and policy expertise to build their own sphere of influence within the royal structure. "How wonderful," Cordelia said, maintaining her composed exterior while internally recalibrating her approach. "I'm sure His Majesty would be interested in hearing how our domestic programs might enhance our international relationships." "Actually," Catherine replied, "William and I have prepared a comprehensive briefing on that exact topic. We were planning to present it to Father next week, along with our recommendations for expanding several other successful initiatives. The use of Father instead of His Majesty was subtle but significant, emphasizing the personal family relationship rather than the formal governmental structure. It was a reminder that while Cordelia might be the queen consort, Catherine and William had connections to the king that preceded her arrival and would continue long after any political changes. As they returned to the main gathering, Cordelia's mind raced through the implications of what she had just learned. William and Catherine weren't just preparing for their future roles. They were actively building an alternative power center within the current administration. Their combination of military expertise, policy knowledge, public popularity, and family connections created a formidable political force. The remainder of the evening passed in a careful dance of social interactions, with various guests seeking audiences with different members of the royal family. Cordelia observed carefully, noting which dignitaries spent time with William and Catherine versus those who approached her and Edmund. The pattern was revealing. Younger parliamentarians, military officials, and representatives from progressive organizations gravitated toward the prince and princess, while established political figures and traditional allies maintained their loyalty to the king and queen consort. By the time the last guest departed well past midnight, Cordelia had reached a sobering conclusion. Her position, which she had believed to be unassailable due to her long relationship with Edmund and her deep understanding of palace politics, was being systematically undermined by a more modern and appealing alternative. As she prepared for bed, removing the heavy diamond necklace and ornate tiara that symbolized her royal status, Cordelia stared at her reflection in the antique mirror. The woman looking back at her was still beautiful, still intelligent, still politically savvy. But she was also fighting a battle on multiple fronts against opponents who had advantages she could never match: youth, genuine popularity, and the promise of the future rather than the defense of the past. The anniversary celebration had been intended as a display of her continued influence and authority. Instead, it had revealed the extent to which that influence was already being challenged by forces she had underestimated. As she finally settled into bed beside the sleeping king, Cordelia began planning her next moves in what had clearly become a much more complex and dangerous game than she had realized. The real struggle for power in Eldermere was just beginning. 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner, the carefully maintained facade of royal unity began showing its first visible cracks. The morning newspapers carried headlines that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Palace sources suggest growing tensions over succession reforms and royal family divided on kingdom's future direction. Cordelia sat in her private study, reading the coverage with growing alarm. Someone was leaking information to the press, and the details were far too accurate to be mere speculation. The articles described internal disagreements about policy priorities, conflicting visions for the monarchy's role, and unnamed sources suggesting that certain members of the royal family were taking matters into their own hands. Margaret entered with her usual morning briefing, but her expression was more troubled than usual. "Your Majesty, we need to discuss the media situation." Lord Pemberton called this morning to express concern about the coverage. He's worried that public uncertainty about royal unity could affect parliamentary support for the trade agreement. "Do we know where these leaks are coming from?" Cordelia asked, setting aside the newspapers with visible frustration. "That's complicated, Your Majesty. The information appears to be coming from multiple sources, but the pattern suggests someone with access to both policy discussions and family conversations." The implication hung in the air between them. In a palace where access was carefully controlled and loyalty was supposed to be absolute, the most damaging leaks typically came from those closest to the centers of power. Either someone in Cordelia's inner circle had turned against her, or William and Catherine had their own network of allies willing to share strategic information with the media. Before they could discuss the matter further, Cordelia's secretary announced an unexpected visitor. Prince William himself, requesting an immediate private audience. Margaret gathered her papers and departed as William entered, his bearing formal but his expression determined. "Stepmother, I think we need to have an honest conversation about the direction of recent events," he began without preamble. "These newspaper articles are damaging to the entire family, and I believe we can resolve the underlying issues before they escalate further." Cordelia gestured for him to sit, but remained standing herself, a subtle assertion of authority. "I agree that the media coverage is unfortunate, though I'm curious about your thoughts on its source." William's pause was slight, but noticeable. "I think the more important question is how we move forward constructively. The kingdom faces several significant challenges that require coordinated royal support: the trade agreement, the education reforms, the military modernization program, and the Constitutional Review Committee's recommendations." It was a comprehensive list that demonstrated his deep involvement in government affairs, far beyond what any heir apparent had traditionally undertaken while a parent still reigned. But it was his next statement that revealed the true purpose of his visit. "Father asked me to discuss these matters with you directly, since he values your political insight and wants to ensure we're presenting a united front to Parliament and the public." Cordelia felt a moment of genuine surprise. Edmund rarely made such requests without discussing them with her first, and the timing seemed far too convenient. Either the king was becoming concerned about the growing tensions within the family, or William was taking liberties with his father's authority to justify his actions. "How thoughtful of His Majesty," she replied carefully, "though I'm curious why he didn't mention this conversation when we spoke yesterday evening." William's expression remained composed, but Cordelia caught a flicker of something that might have been calculation or concern. Perhaps he wanted to see how our discussion progressed before finalizing any formal arrangements. You know how he prefers to evaluate all perspectives before making decisions. It was a masterfully diplomatic response that neither confirmed nor denied her suspicion, while positioning their conversation as part of Edmund's broader decision-making process, rather than William's independent initiative. The prince had clearly learned more about political maneuvering than she had credited him with. "Very well," Cordelia said, settling into her chair. "What specifically did you want to discuss?" "I think we should coordinate our approaches to the various parliamentary committees instead of pursuing parallel strategies. Your relationship with Lord Pemberton and the traditional conservative faction is obviously valuable, but some of the younger MPs respond better to different messaging." William proceeded to outline a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of parliamentary dynamics, identifying specific legislators who could be influenced through various combinations of policy arguments, personal appeals, and strategic timing. His analysis revealed not just knowledge of current political alignments, but insight into how those alignments were shifting as generational changes reshaped the legislature. The Defense Committee, in particular, has been expressing interest in modernizing our international agreements to reflect current security realities, he continued. They're especially interested in Catherine's research on how educational partnerships can support diplomatic relationships. There it was again, the seamless integration of Catherine's work into broader political strategy. Cordelia was beginning to understand that their partnership was more comprehensive than she had realized. Catherine wasn't simply a popular public figure supporting William's political ambitions. She was developing genuine expertise in policy areas that complemented his military and governmental knowledge. "Catherine has been researching international educational partnerships?" Cordelia asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. "She's been working with the University Coalition and several international organizations to develop frameworks for academic exchanges that could strengthen our cultural relationships with other kingdoms. The preliminary data suggests significant potential for both diplomatic and economic benefits." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with William demonstrating detailed knowledge of legislative procedures, international relationships, and policy implementation that far exceeded what Cordelia had expected from someone supposedly focused on military service and charitable work. By the time he departed with polite thanks for her time and attention, she was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Prince William was not simply preparing for his eventual role as king. He was actively building the expertise, relationships, and political infrastructure necessary to assume that role far sooner than anyone had anticipated. His combination of military experience, policy knowledge, and strategic thinking, enhanced by Catherine's public appeal and complementary skills, represented a formidable challenge to the existing power structure. That afternoon, Cordelia requested a private meeting with King Edmund, something that had become increasingly rare as his schedule filled with governmental duties and official obligations. When they finally met in his study that evening, she approached the conversation with unusual directness. "Edmund, I need to understand your current thinking about succession planning and the timeline for transferring certain responsibilities to William." The king looked up from the constitutional review documents he had been studying, his expression thoughtful. "That's an interesting question, Cordelia. What's prompted this particular concern?" William's increased involvement in parliamentary affairs, his meetings with committee chairs, his coordination with various government departments. Either he's taking initiatives without your knowledge, or there are plans being made that haven't been shared with me. Edmund was quiet for several moments, a habit she recognized from their years of working together. When he finally responded, his tone was measured but revealing. "William has been asking more detailed questions about governmental procedures lately. He's also been presenting some quite sophisticated policy analyses, particularly regarding our international relationships and domestic reform priorities. And you've been encouraging this increased involvement?" "I've been receptive to his input. His perspective brings valuable insights, especially on matters involving military considerations or contemporary social issues." Cordelia felt a chill of recognition. Edmund's careful phrasing indicated that he was not just tolerating William's political activities, he was beginning to rely on them. After decades of depending primarily on her counsel for complex political decisions, the king was developing alternative sources of advice and analysis. As she prepared to leave his study, Edmund made one final comment that confirmed her worst fears. "Cordelia, I think it might be beneficial for you to work more closely with William and Catherine on the upcoming legislative priorities. Their fresh perspective could complement your experience in ways that strengthen all our efforts." It was phrased as a suggestion, but coming from the king, it carried the weight of a directive. More importantly, it indicated that Edmund saw the future of royal political engagement as a collaborative effort between all family members, rather than the traditional arrangement where he relied primarily on his queen consort for strategic guidance. That night, as Cordelia reviewed the events of the past several weeks, she realized that the battle for influence within the royal family had already been lost, and won while she was still planning her opening moves. William and Catherine had not challenged her authority directly. They had simply built an alternative that made her traditional role increasingly irrelevant. The question now was whether she would fight to maintain her diminishing influence or find a way to adapt to a new reality where power was shared rather than controlled. The crisis that would define the future of the Eldermere monarchy arrived on a gray Thursday morning in the form of an emergency cabinet meeting. News had broken overnight that the neighboring kingdom of Astoria was experiencing significant political upheaval, with their parliament voting no confidence in their prime minister amid allegations of corruption and economic mismanagement. The situation threatened to destabilize the entire region's economy and required immediate diplomatic response. Cordelia learned about the meeting not from Edmund, but from Margaret, who had heard about it through palace staff channels. By the time she reached the council chamber, King Edmund, Prince William, and several senior ministers were already deep in discussion about potential responses to the Asturian crisis. "The key issue is whether we support the current government or maintain strict neutrality while offering humanitarian assistance," Foreign Minister Davidson was explaining as Cordelia entered. "Each approach has significant implications for our trade relationships and regional security commitments." Edmund looked up as his wife entered, his expression showing brief surprise followed by something that might have been mild embarrassment. "Cordelia, I apologize. The situation developed so rapidly overnight that I didn't want to delay assembling the core response team." The phrase core response team hit her like a physical blow. For 20 years, she had been Edmund's primary advisor on international crises. Her analysis of political situations and understanding of complex diplomatic relationships had been fundamental to the kingdom's foreign policy success. Yet here she was, arriving after the fact, to find that decisions were being made without her input. "Of course," she replied smoothly, taking a seat at the table. "Perhaps someone could brief me on the current assessment?" William looked to his father before responding. "The situation is quite fluid, but we've identified several immediate priorities. First, we need to coordinate with our embassy in Astoria to ensure the safety of our citizens. Second, we should prepare contingency plans for potential refugee movements across our shared border. Third, we need to assess the economic implications for our trade agreements and supply chains." His analysis was comprehensive and well-structured, demonstrating not just knowledge of the immediate crisis, but understanding of its broader implications. As he continued outlining potential responses, Cordelia realized that this was not a hasty reaction to breaking news, but a carefully prepared briefing that suggested advanced preparation and detailed intelligence gathering. "William has been monitoring the Astorian situation for several weeks," Edmund explained, noting Cordelia's thoughtful expression. His assessment proved quite prescient about the likelihood of governmental collapse. "Several weeks?" Cordelia asked, keeping her tone neutral despite her growing alarm. "The signs were becoming increasingly clear to anyone with military intelligence experience," William replied. Catherine's educational exchange contacts in Astoria were reporting growing unrest among university students and faculty. Combined with the economic indicators and our embassy's political reporting, the trajectory became fairly obvious. Once again, Catherine's work had provided valuable intelligence that complemented William's analysis. Cordelia was beginning to understand that their partnership extended far beyond public appearances and charitable work. They had developed an informal but sophisticated intelligence network that operated parallel to official government channels. Foreign Minister Davidson continued his briefing, but Cordelia found herself studying the dynamics around the table rather than focusing solely on his words. The other ministers directed most of their questions and comments to William rather than to Edmund, seeking his opinions on military implications, refugee logistics, and coordination with allied kingdoms. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The government officials were already treating the prince as their primary royal contact for crisis management. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, during which detailed plans were developed for multiple scenarios ranging from limited economic disruption to complete governmental collapse in Astoria. Throughout the discussions, Cordelia contributed when asked for her opinion, but found that most decisions had been effectively made before she arrived. Her traditional role as Edmund's primary advisor had been quietly superseded by a new structure that positioned William as the royal family's primary liaison with government officials. As the ministers departed to implement their assigned responsibilities, Edmund asked William to remain behind for additional discussion about coordination with allied kingdoms. Cordelia realized she was being politely dismissed from conversations that would have been unthinkable to conduct without her just months earlier. That afternoon, she requested an urgent meeting with Catherine, something she had never done before despite years of formal family relationships. They met in Catherine's private sitting room, a comfortable space that reflected the princess's blend of elegance and accessibility. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me on such short notice," Cordelia began, accepting the offered tea while studying Catherine's demeanor for clues about her current thinking. "Of course," Catherine replied warmly. "I imagine the Astorian situation has created significant demands on everyone's time and attention." Indeed, though I was surprised to learn about William's advanced monitoring of the situation and particularly interested in your role in gathering intelligence through educational contacts. Catherine's pause was almost imperceptible, but Cordelia caught it. I wouldn't characterize my communications with university colleagues as intelligence gathering. I maintain professional relationships with educators throughout the region as part of my literacy and education initiatives. When those colleagues expressed concerns about growing social unrest, it seemed appropriate to share that information with William. It was a careful explanation that acknowledged the intelligence value of her contacts while framing them as natural extensions of her charitable work rather than deliberate intelligence operations. But Cordelia was experienced enough to recognize sophisticated political maneuvering when she encountered it. How long have you and William been coordinating your various activities in this manner? Cordelia asked directly. Catherine set down her teacup and met Cordelia's gaze directly. We've always shared information that seemed relevant to our respective responsibilities. Recently, that coordination has become more systematic as our roles have evolved. And how would you characterize the evolution of those roles? I think that's really a question for the king and William to address, Catherine replied diplomatically. My focus remains on the charitable and educational initiatives that I've always prioritized. If those activities occasionally provide insights that are useful to broader governmental functions, I'm pleased to contribute to the kingdom's success. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with both women maintaining perfectly polite facades while conducting what amounted to a careful interrogation about intentions, loyalties, and future plans. By its conclusion, Cordelia understood that Catherine was far more politically sophisticated than her public image suggested, and that she and William had indeed been building an alternative power structure with deliberate strategic planning. That evening, Cordelia made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Instead of fighting to maintain her traditional role as Edmund's primary advisor, she would adapt to the changing reality by finding ways to work within the new power structure rather than against it. She requested a private meeting with William the following morning, but this time her approach was entirely different. William, I think we need to discuss how we can coordinate our efforts more effectively, she began. The Asturian crisis has made it clear that the royal family's governmental engagement has evolved significantly, and I'd like to find ways to contribute constructively to our collective success. William's expression showed genuine surprise, followed by cautious interest. I would certainly welcome your input and experience, stepmother. Your understanding of international relationships and parliamentary dynamics would be valuable to many of our current initiatives. What I'm suggesting is more comprehensive than occasional consultation, Cordelia continued. I'm proposing that we establish a formal coordination structure that combines my experience with your military and policy expertise and Catherine's public engagement and intelligence gathering capabilities. It was a complete reversal of her previous strategy, but Cordelia had recognized something crucial. Fighting against William and Catherine's growing influence would only accelerate her marginalization. By positioning herself as an ally and collaborator rather than an obstacle, she might maintain significant influence within the new power structure they were building. William was quiet for several moments before responding. That's an intriguing proposal. What kind of coordination structure did you have in mind? Something that acknowledges your leadership role in governmental affairs while utilizing everyone's particular strengths and expertise. A partnership rather than hierarchy. As they began discussing specific arrangements, Cordelia felt a mixture of relief and regret. She was saving her political career, but at the cost of accepting a fundamental shift in royal power dynamics that she had spent decades trying to prevent. The kingdom was changing, and she could either change with it or be left behind by forces that had already proven they could function effectively without her. The old order was ending, but perhaps the new one could still include her voice if she was wise enough to recognize reality and adapt accordingly. 6 months after the Asturian crisis, the new coordination structure within the royal family had evolved into something unprecedented in the kingdom's history. What had begun as Cordelia's desperate attempt to maintain relevance had transformed into a genuinely effective partnership that combined traditional diplomatic experience with innovative approaches to modern governance. The morning briefing in Edmund's study now included all three key figures: Cordelia, with her comprehensive understanding of parliamentary relationships and international politics; William, with his military expertise and policy analysis capabilities; and Catherine, participating through secure video connection when her schedule permitted, contributing insights from her expanding network of educational, charitable, and cultural contacts. The Asturian reconstruction is proceeding ahead of schedule, William reported, reviewing the latest intelligence summaries. Their new government has expressed formal gratitude for our humanitarian assistance and early diplomatic recognition. Prime Minister Helena has requested a state visit to formalize the enhanced trade agreements we've been developing. Edmund nodded approvingly. Cordelia, what's your assessment of parliamentary support for the expanded trade provisions? Quite strong, particularly after our coordinated outreach campaign, she replied, consulting her detailed notes about conversations with various legislative leaders. Lord Pemberton's committee is fully supportive, and even the traditional isolationist faction has come around after Catherine's presentation about educational benefits. The presentation she referenced had been Catherine's idea, a comprehensive analysis of how educational exchanges and cultural programs could strengthen economic relationships while building long-term stability in the region. It had been delivered jointly by Catherine and Cordelia, combining the princess's policy research with the queen consort's political experience to create a compelling case that appealed to both progressive and conservative legislators. Speaking of Catherine's initiatives, Edmund continued, I understand her literacy program has attracted international attention. 3 kingdoms have requested detailed briefings about implementation strategies, William confirmed. The Norvanian delegation was particularly interested in adapting the community partnership model for their rural provinces. Catherine has been working with our foreign ministry to develop formal technical assistance programs. Cordelia had initially been skeptical about Catherine's expanding international role, but the results were undeniable. The princess had demonstrated remarkable skill at building relationships with foreign officials who might have been resistant to traditional diplomatic approaches. Her combination of genuine expertise, personal warmth, and royal status created unique opportunities for cultural diplomacy that complemented conventional international relations. More importantly, the collaborative approach had proven politically valuable for everyone involved. Cordelia's continued involvement in major policy decisions maintained her status with traditional allies, while her partnership with William and Catherine enhanced her credibility with younger political figures who had previously dismissed her as outdated. William gained the benefit of experienced political guidance while establishing his credentials as a capable future leader. Catherine expanded her influence beyond charitable work into substantive policy areas while maintaining her popular appeal. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Several members of Edmund's traditional advisory council had initially resisted the changes, viewing them as unnecessary complications to established procedures. Foreign governments had required time to adjust to the more complex, but ultimately more comprehensive royal engagement with international affairs. Most significantly, the media had struggled to understand and explain the new power dynamics, leading to months of speculation about conflicts and competitions that no longer reflected reality. The Constitutional Review Committee has completed their preliminary recommendations, Edmund announced, introducing the day's main agenda item. They're proposing several significant modifications to succession procedures and governmental relationships that will require careful parliamentary management. The Constitutional Review had been ongoing for nearly 2 years, examining how the monarchy's role should evolve to address contemporary governance challenges. The committee's recommendations would fundamentally reshape royal responsibilities and authorities, making the current family dynamics even more crucial to the kingdom's future stability. William distributed copies of the committee's executive summary, a document that Cordelia noted had been thoroughly analyzed and annotated. The key recommendations involve modernizing succession procedures to emphasize merit and capability alongside traditional hereditary principles, expanding royal authority in certain areas while creating new accountability mechanisms, and formalizing coordination requirements between royal family members and elected officials. In practical terms, Cordelia added after reviewing the proposals, these changes would require the kind of collaborative approach we've been developing, while also providing legal framework for our expanded roles in governmental affairs. The recommendations essentially codified what they had created through necessity and adaptation, a royal structure that distributed responsibilities among family members based on expertise and effectiveness rather than rigid traditional hierarchies. Edmund would remain the ultimate authority, but with formal recognition that complex modern governance required diverse skills and perspectives. Catherine joined the conversation via video conference from a literacy center in the northern provinces, where she was observing implementation of new teaching methods developed through international partnerships. "I've reviewed the education sections of the constitutional recommendations," she reported. "The provisions for royal involvement in cultural diplomacy and international educational cooperation are quite comprehensive. They would formalize many of the relationships I've been developing while creating accountability standards for measuring results." "What's your assessment of public reaction to these changes?" Edmund asked, addressing the group collectively. "Generally positive," Cordelia responded first. "The polling data suggests that people appreciate seeing the royal family actively engaged in solving practical problems rather than simply performing ceremonial functions. The collaborative approach has actually enhanced rather than diminished respect for royal authority." William nodded in agreement. "The military leadership has been particularly supportive. They see the expanded role as recognition that modern security challenges require integration of diplomatic, economic, and cultural strategies rather than purely military responses." "The international reaction has been intriguing," Catherine added. "Several allied kingdoms have begun examining similar modernization approaches. The Norvanian queen mentioned that their constitutional scholars are studying our model as a potential framework for their own reforms." As the meeting concluded with assignments for managing the parliamentary review process, Cordelia reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her position and prospects. 6 months earlier, she had been fighting desperately to maintain influence that seemed to be slipping away despite her years of dedicated service. Now she was an integral part of a governing structure that was not only more effective than the traditional approach, but also more personally fulfilling than she had expected. The partnership had required significant adjustments to her expectations and methods. She could no longer expect to be Edmund's sole advisor on major decisions, but her counsel carried more weight when combined with complementary perspectives from William and Catherine. She had to share credit for successes, but she also shared responsibility for failures and received support during particularly challenging negotiations. Most importantly, the collaborative approach had revealed capabilities and interests she hadn't fully explored during her years as the primary royal advisor. Working with Catherine had enhanced her understanding of cultural diplomacy and international development issues. Collaborating with William had expanded her knowledge of military strategy and contemporary security challenges. The combination had made her more effective at her traditional diplomatic and political responsibilities while opening new areas for contribution. That evening, as she prepared for bed following a successful dinner with foreign diplomats who had praised the kingdom's innovative approach to international cooperation, Cordelia considered the irony of her situation. Her attempt to fight against change had ultimately led her to embrace a transformation that strengthened rather than threatened her influence and effectiveness. The old model of royal governance, where power was concentrated in traditional hierarchies and formal protocols, was giving way to something more dynamic and responsive to contemporary challenges. The kingdom was stronger for the change. The royal family was more unified despite their more complex relationships, and she personally had found purposes and satisfactions that she never could have imagined when she first married Edmund 20 years earlier. As she settled into sleep beside the king who had learned to value collaborative counsel above individual advice, Cordelia smiled at the recognition that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, and that wisdom often involves knowing when to stop fighting battles that have already been won by different strategies entirely. The power struggle that had threatened to tear the royal family apart had instead created something stronger, more flexible, and better equipped to serve the kingdom's evolving needs. In the end, everyone had gained more than they had risked, and the future looked brighter than anyone had dared to hope.